Emily Harrison was just 17 when her life was cut short under mysterious circumstances. And now her parents, Richard and Claire Harrison, and her younger brother Max, are at the center of a chilling investigation. What began as a tragic death in a quiet suburban home soon unraveled into a dark web of secrets, surveillance, and betrayal. As detectives dig deeper, one haunting truth becomes impossible to ignore. Someone in this family is lying. The Harrison family lived in the heart of Maplewood, a quiet town known more for its flower festivals and book clubs than for crime scenes and newspaper headlines. Their home, a cream-colored two-story house with blue shutters and a well-manicured lawn, sat on the corner of Elm Street, just a few blocks away from Maplewood High School. From the outside, everything about the Harrison family seemed idyllic. They were the kind of family neighbors pointed to as an example of how to raise children right. Richard Harrison, the father, taught history at the local high school and was beloved by students for his passion and dedication. Claire, his wife, worked part-time as a librarian at the town's public library and was often seen walking their golden retriever, Scout, around the block in the early evenings. Their children, Max and Emily, were polite, well-dressed, and always said please and thank you. Emily, the older of the two, was 17 and already mapping out her future. She had recently received an early acceptance letter to a prestigious university. Her teachers spoke highly of her, smart, respectful, driven. Emily was the editor of the school's literary magazine, played piano at the community center, and volunteered twice a week at a local animal shelter. She was the kind of teenager parents dream of, focused, kind, and seemingly immune to the typical high school drama. Her younger brother Max was 12 and quiet by nature. He preferred books over games, often kept to himself, and rarely caused any trouble. To those who knew the Harrisons only in passing, they looked like the kind of family you'd see in a holiday card. But what people saw wasn't the full picture. If you asked their closest neighbors, some would recall strange things they had brushed off at the time. A few remembered hearing shouting from inside the Harrison house late at night. Raised voices, sometimes followed by silence. Others recalled seeing Claire sitting alone in her car in the driveway for long stretches, staring at the steering wheel. A police report confirmed that there had been at least 3 wellness calls made to the Harrison home in the last year. Each time, the situation had been explained away. Stress, a misunderstanding, just a family going through a rough patch. No one pressed further. Maplewood wasn't the kind of town where people expected dark things to happen behind closed doors. And certainly not to a family like the Harrisons. Everything changed on the morning of March 3rd. It was a chilly Friday, and snow still covered parts of the front lawn. That morning, Claire called 911 just after 7:20 a.m. Her voice, calm but shaking, told the dispatcher that her daughter wasn't breathing. When first responders arrived, they found Emily lying on her bed, still in her pajamas, with one arm outstretched, and her phone in her hand. There were no signs of injury, no blood, no mess. Her room looked spotless. Too spotless. The bed had been made, the curtains tied back neatly. A cup of tea sat untouched on her bedside table. Paramedics attempted CPR, but it was too late. Emily had been dead for hours. As word spread, the entire town seemed to freeze in disbelief. Emily Harrison, brilliant, kind, beautiful Emily, gone without warning. The school cancelled classes for the day, and the library lowered its flag to half-mast. Friends gathered outside the Harrison home, leaving flowers and handwritten notes. The family released a brief statement through the police, asking for privacy as they grieved. But the grieving didn't stop the questions from coming. The initial report from the coroner noted no visible injuries, no signs of trauma. Toxicology was ordered, and in the meantime, detectives began piecing together Emily's final hours. Her last known activity was a text to her best friend at 9:48 p.m., saying goodnight. Her phone showed no calls after that, and her social media activity abruptly stopped. Surveillance cameras from nearby homes showed nothing unusual. No break-ins, no strangers near the property. Investigators noted one strange detail that stuck with them from the very beginning. The house was locked from the inside. All doors, all windows. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be missing from the house. Emily's jewelry, laptop, and wallet were still in her room. The only people in the house that night were Richard, Claire, Max, and Emily. As the days passed, more unsettling details came to light. Claire had taken sleeping pills that night, something she admitted to when asked. Richard claimed he had fallen asleep on the living room couch while grading papers. Max said he had gone to bed after dinner and didn't wake up until the next morning. All three seemed shocked, heartbroken, and utterly confused by what had happened. But to detectives, something about their stories didn't sit right. For one, the house was too clean. Emily's bed looked as if it had been remade, not slept in. The sheets were crisp and tucked tightly, as if someone had straightened them out. Her room smelled faintly of bleach, not unusual for a well-kept home, but strange in a teenager's bedroom. The tea on her nightstand had been poured but not touched. It was still warm when police arrived. None of it added up. Meanwhile, the autopsy results were pending, and until they arrived, investigators were left to guess. They canvassed the neighborhood again. They dug through Emily's school records, her social media accounts, her text messages. Friends said she had seemed distracted in the weeks leading up to her death. She was still doing well in school, still showing up on time, but there was something different, a tiredness in her eyes, a tension in her posture. She had started saying no to hangouts. She stopped volunteering at the animal shelter. She had even skipped a piano recital 2 weeks earlier, something she had never done before. Her best friend mentioned one odd thing that stuck in the detectives' minds. Emily had told her recently that she didn't feel safe at home anymore. She didn't elaborate, and when asked about it, Claire and Richard dismissed it as a misunderstanding. They said Emily had been under pressure with college applications, and that she'd always been sensitive. Still, the more police dug, the more cracks they found in the perfect image of the Harrison family. Claire had seen a therapist in secret for the past 6 months. Richard had received a disciplinary warning at school over an inappropriate comment to a student, something quickly buried by the administration. And Max? No one seemed to know. Much about Max. Teachers described him as bright but withdrawn, a boy who kept his head down and avoided eye contact, a boy who once turned in a short story that ended with a family member dying quietly in their sleep. On the surface, it was still possible to believe Emily's death was a medical tragedy, a sudden illness that no one could have predicted. But something about it all felt wrong. Something about that house, locked up tight, so clean, so still, whispered that this wasn't an accident. And for the first time in Maplewood's quiet history, homicide detectives decided to stay. The investigation into Emily Harrison's death began slowly, methodically, as detectives tried to piece together what had happened inside the seemingly peaceful Harrison home on the night of March 2nd. From the moment the first officers entered the house, something felt off. Emily's bedroom, the supposed scene of a sudden and tragic death, looked more like a hotel room prepared for a guest than the room of a teenager who had died in the night. The bed was carefully made, sheets tucked in with military precision. The hardwood floor had recently been mopped, and a faint scent of bleach hung in the air. Everything seemed too orderly, too deliberate. There were no signs of chaos, no mess, and no indication that Emily had been in any kind of distress. Detectives began with the basics. They documented the entire scene, photographing every inch of the room, collecting samples from surfaces, and bagging the cup of tea on the nightstand. It was a simple porcelain mug with a pattern of blue flowers, Emily's favorite. The tea was cold by the time it was collected, but the residue inside would later become the focal point of the entire investigation. Emily's body was taken for autopsy within hours of being found. While the medical examiner worked, detectives turned their attention to the rest of the house. There were no broken windows, no damaged locks, and no indication of forced entry. All the doors were locked from the inside, and the alarm system had been deactivated manually the night before. Nothing was stolen. Emily's laptop, phone, and wallet were untouched. Her jewelry was in a box on her dresser, untouched. It became clear almost immediately that robbery or a home invasion could be ruled out. Claire Harrison, visibly shaken, told officers that she had gone to bed early that night after taking her usual sleeping pills. She said she didn't hear anything unusual and had woken up around 7 a.m., expecting to find Emily getting ready for school. When she entered Emily's room, she found her daughter lying motionless on the bed. At first, she thought Emily had just overslept, but when she tried to wake her, she realized something was terribly wrong. Her screams woke Richard, who had slept downstairs, and Max, whose bedroom was at the far end of the hall. Richard's account of the night was straightforward. He said he had been grading papers on the couch and fell asleep sometime after midnight. He claimed he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. He found out what had happened only after Claire ran down the stairs in a panic. Max, groggy and confused, told officers he had gone to bed around 9:30 p.m. and stayed in his room until morning. When asked if he'd heard anything during the night, he said he had woken up briefly and thought he heard a soft noise, like crying, but assumed it was the wind. Despite the family's cooperative behavior, detectives were unsettled. The emotional responses seemed inconsistent. Claire was distraught one moment and calm the next. Richard was quiet, almost too quiet. Max avoided eye contact and kept his answers short. As a precaution, police asked for digital devices, permission to search the house thoroughly, and access to the family's online accounts. The Harrisons agreed without hesitation. Back at the lab, the autopsy results arrived. There were no signs of physical trauma. No bruising, no cuts, no broken bones. There were no substances in her stomach that would suggest an overdose of over-the-counter medication or alcohol. But traces of a rare and fast-acting toxin were found in her bloodstream. One, not commonly seen outside of controlled medical settings. It was often used in veterinary procedures or illegal poisonings. It could be easily mixed into food or drink, tasteless and nearly invisible. The dosage found in Emily's system was enough to slow her heart, depress her breathing, and eventually stop it entirely, all without leaving obvious signs. Attention immediately shifted to the cup of tea. Tests confirmed the presence of the same toxin inside. Emily had been poisoned. Now that foul play was confirmed, the investigation escalated. The question was no longer what had happened, but who had done it, and how. Since there was no sign of forced entry and the home had been locked from within. The working theory was chilling. Emily had been murdered by someone inside the house. Detectives went over surveillance footage from nearby homes. One camera across the street captured the front of the Harrison house. It showed no visitors after 6 p.m., no delivery drivers, no strangers loitering. The only people who entered or exited the home that night were members of the Harrison family. No one else came in. The next step was motive. Why would anyone want Emily dead? She had no known enemies, no signs of bullying, no involvement in drugs or risky behavior. Her school life was clean. Her social media was tame. Friends described her as warm, sensitive, and occasionally anxious, but never confrontational. She had recently pulled away from some friends, citing stress, but nothing alarming had been reported. Detectives searched her room thoroughly. In a drawer beneath her bed, they found a notebook filled with sketches and poetry. One entry stood out. It read simply, "I feel like I'm being watched even when I'm alone." The date was just a week before her death. They found several emails. On her laptop, written but never sent. Drafts addressed to a guidance counselor, to a friend, even one to her mother. In them, she described feeling unsafe, overwhelmed, and unsure of who to trust. She didn't name anyone, but the tone suggested deep fear. The email to her mother was especially chilling. It said, "I wish I could tell you everything, but I know you wouldn't believe me." The investigation turned inward. Detectives looked closely at each family member, starting with Claire. Her internet search history included queries about sleep aids and home remedies, but nothing directly linked to toxins. However, her phone logs showed a call at 2:13 a.m. the night Emily died, to a number that wasn't in her contacts. It rang for less than 30 seconds. When asked about it, she said she didn't remember making the call. Richard's work computer was taken in for analysis. It had a separate user account that had been used to access a private browser. On it, investigators found a trail of deleted searches related to rare poisons and their effects. Richard denied making the searches. He said his account had been left open in the classroom multiple times and suggested a student could have accessed it. Max's tablet was examined next. His digital footprint was light, but there were a few unusual things. He had been researching topics like how to make someone sleep forever and what happens when you drink cleaning chemicals. He had also been watching videos about death and forensic science, content well beyond what a typical 12-year-old might explore. Each member of the family had something to hide, something unspoken, something off. And now, with the confirmation that Emily had been murdered in her own bed, detectives faced a terrifying realization. Someone in the Harrison family wasn't just lying, they were hiding a deadly truth. As the investigation deepened, detectives shifted their focus from the house itself to the people inside it. With confirmation that Emily had been poisoned and no sign of forced entry, suspicion settled squarely on the remaining 3 members of the Harrison family. Everyone in the town had a theory, but none of them prepared detectives for the tangle of secrets that would slowly come undone over the next several days. Each family member was interviewed separately. Detectives wanted to observe their stories without outside influence, to see if timelines matched or if any subtle cracks began to form. Claire Harrison, Emily's mother, was the first to return to the station. She looked worn, pale, her hands shaking as she clasped a cup of coffee she never drank. Her account of the night remained consistent with what she had told officers the morning Emily was found. She said she had taken her usual sleeping pills around 9:30 p.m. and gone straight to bed. She insisted she didn't wake again until morning. When asked about the call made from her phone in the middle of the night, Claire hesitated. She said she didn't remember making it and suggested maybe she had accidentally pressed a button in her sleep. But when pressed further, she appeared increasingly anxious, her voice faltering. There was a weight behind her eyes that she couldn't hide. Richard Harrison arrived later that same afternoon, his demeanor starkly different. He was calm, composed, even slightly detached. He recited the events of the night like a teacher recalling a lecture. He said he had stayed downstairs to finish grading papers, fallen asleep on the couch, and woken only after Claire screamed the next morning. When asked about the searches found on his work computer related to toxins and poisons, Richard immediately denied any involvement. He explained that the computer was often left unattended in his classroom, accessible to students. It wasn't unusual, he claimed, for kids to prank teachers or look up strange things when left alone, but detectives found it suspicious that such specific searches had occurred after school hours, when the building was locked and no one else was likely around. Richard didn't flinch under questioning, but something about his rehearsed tone didn't sit right. Then came Max, the youngest in the family, and in many ways, the most complicated. At 12 years old, he was still a child in the eyes of the law, but investigators couldn't ignore the unusual gaps in his story. Max said he had gone to bed early after dinner and didn't wake until morning. However, during his second interview, he changed a small detail. He now claimed he woke up around midnight and thought he heard Emily crying softly. He didn't say anything or leave his room. When asked why, he shrugged and said he thought she was just upset about school. This detail contradicted his original statement, and while it might seem minor, investigators knew from experience that small cracks often pointed to bigger breaks underneath. More worrying were Max's recent internet searches. On his tablet, detectives found queries that included how to make someone fall asleep forever, and is there a poison that leaves no trace? When questioned, Max said he had just been curious, having recently watched a crime show that sparked his interest. He denied any intention behind the searches. His tone was flat, and his eyes stayed downcast for most of the interview. At this point, the evidence wasn't conclusive enough to charge anyone, but it was mounting, and suspicions were high. Detectives turned to Emily's digital life for clues. Her laptop and phone contained hundreds of text messages, social media interactions, and drafts of unsent emails. Most of her messages were routine, school updates, conversations with friends, photos of her dog. But there were also signs that Emily had been increasingly anxious in the months leading up to her death. One unsent email to her school counselor revealed that she had been feeling overwhelmed and isolated. In it, she mentioned tension at home, the feeling that she was being watched all the time, and the belief that something bad was going to happen to her. She described waking up at night to the sound of footsteps outside her door and feeling like her belongings were being moved when she wasn't in the room. Even more troubling was an email addressed to her best friend that had never been sent. In it, Emily wrote about finding something on her father's computer that disturbed her. She didn't say what it was, only that it made her feel sick. She ended the message with the words, "I don't know if I'm safe anymore." Detectives wanted more. They obtained a warrant to search a small storage unit registered under Emily's name. When they opened it, they found a cardboard box filled with old notebooks, sketch pads, and a cloth bag containing a small photo album. It looked like Emily had been storing personal things outside the house, a strange move for a teenager with her own bedroom. Inside the notebooks were diary entries, some going back more than a year. Most were reflections on her day, school, events, and her dreams. But about 2 months before her death, the tone shifted. Emily started writing about fear, not of a stranger or an outside threat, but of someone in her family. She wrote that she had seen her mother arguing with someone over the phone late at night, and that the arguments sometimes ended in tears. She noticed that Max had become increasingly withdrawn and was scribbling disturbing drawings in the margins of his homework. In one entry, she wrote that she had tried to talk to her father about how she was feeling, but he told her she was imagining things. She described a growing sense that no one in the house was telling the truth anymore. On a page dated just a week before her death, Emily wrote something that sent chills through the investigative team. "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Someone in this family wants me gone." She didn't name anyone directly, but the implication was terrifying. Someone close to her, someone under the same roof, was capable of doing the unthinkable. With each new discovery, the picture of the Harrison family darkened. What had once looked like a loving, stable household was now unraveling. Detectives were no longer dealing with vague suspicions and strange coincidences. The evidence was becoming more focused, and the journal entries tied everything together with haunting clarity. Emily's death was no longer a mystery of means or opportunity. The question now was motive. Who had the most to gain, or the least to lose from silencing her? And with each passing day it became more and more clear. Someone in that house was lying. The tension surrounding the Harrison family reached a breaking point as investigators continued to tighten their circle. Each clue brought them closer to the truth, yet no single piece was enough to trigger an arrest. What was clear by now was that Emily had not only been poisoned, but had likely known that someone in her own home was a threat to her safety. That chilling line in her journal, "Someone in this family wants me gone," served as a guiding light for detectives. All evidence pointed inward. There were no outside suspects, no strangers lurking in the shadows. The danger had been inside, the house the entire time. Detectives began to look deeper into the psychological dynamics between family members. Claire, the grieving mother, presented a facade of quiet devastation, but her behavior didn't always align with someone who had just lost a child. Surveillance of the family in the days following the funeral showed Claire frequently leaving the house for long drives to nowhere. When questioned, she said she needed space to grieve. But investigators learned she had been stopping by the same pharmacy multiple times, each time purchasing small quantities of antihistamines, pain relievers, and sedatives. All legal, all seemingly innocent. But when cross-referenced with pharmacy visits in the weeks before Emily's death, a strange pattern emerged. Claire had visited 5 different pharmacies in 2 weeks, buying medications in small enough amounts to avoid raising suspicion. The combination of substances she purchased could easily be used to render someone unconscious, or worse. When asked about these purchases, Claire said they were for her own use. She explained she'd been battling insomnia, anxiety, and depression since the holidays. Detectives weren't satisfied with the explanation. The volume of medication didn't match her claims, and they still couldn't ignore the call made from her phone at 2:13 a.m., the night Emily died. That number was traced to a disposable phone purchased in another county under a fake name. The number had since been deactivated. Investigators began to suspect Claire might have had more involvement than she let on. Meanwhile, Richard's life was under close scrutiny. Despite his polished exterior, more cracks began to show in his reputation. Teachers and students at the school described him as charming but controlling. Some female students said he often made inappropriate comments. One even claimed he had touched her shoulder in a way that made her uncomfortable. The complaint was dismissed by school administrators as a misunderstanding, but detectives followed up. When they searched Richard's personal laptop, separate from his work device, they found a hidden folder buried beneath layers of encrypted files. The contents were disturbing. Inside the folder were dozens of documents, journal entries, private logs, even printed screenshots of Emily's emails and text messages. Richard had been monitoring her digital life. Investigators realized he'd installed surveillance software on Emily's devices, giving him full access to her emails, search history, and messages. He claimed it was for her safety, that he was worried she was being bullied or manipulated online. But the level of control he exercised suggested something darker. He hadn't just been watching Emily. He had been tracking her thoughts, her fears, her movements. One particularly telling file was a list of search terms Emily had entered in the months before her death. Among them were how to report family, abuse, parental control software, legal age to move out, and poison symptoms. Richard had highlighted several of these terms in red. In his own notes, he wrote things like, "She's becoming suspicious," and "monitor" more closely. That level of preoccupation with his daughter's autonomy raised serious concerns about motive and intent. While Claire and Richard's stories continued to unravel, Max remained the quiet enigma. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his responses were brief and void of emotion. A child psychologist was brought in to evaluate him. During sessions, Max drew pictures, mostly of trees, animals, and houses, but one drawing stood out. It was a picture of a girl lying in bed with X over her eyes. Next to her were three shadowy figures, all standing over the bed. When asked who the figures were, Max simply said, "It's just a story." He offered no further explanation. Investigators examined Max's school records. He was a gifted student, but teachers described him as emotionally withdrawn and socially distant. One teacher noted that Max had once written a story about a sister who disappears and is never found. In the story, the rest of the family goes on pretending she never existed. That story was dated 3 months before Emily's death. Detectives began to consider a horrifying possibility. What if more than one person in the family had been involved? What if Emily's death hadn't been the work of a single individual, but a collective effort to silence her? It seemed unlikely at first. But the way the family closed ranks, the overlapping lies, and the quiet coordination of behavior suggested something more than coincidence. Then, the toxicology report from the cup of tea finally arrived. In addition to the rare toxin that had caused her death, the lab also found trace amounts of diphenhydramine, a common sleep aid. That matched the medications Claire had been purchasing, but the dosage levels indicated that the poison had been administered in stages. Emily had likely consumed the sedative first, possibly unknowingly, followed by the fatal toxin. This meant her death wasn't a rash decision. It had been carefully planned, measured, and executed with chilling precision. Faced with mounting evidence, detectives decided it was time to apply pressure. They separated the family once more, this time presenting them with fragments of what had been uncovered. Photos of the hidden folder on Richard's laptop, pharmacy records tied to Claire, and the contents of Emily's private journals. When Told that the investigation was close to concluding, Claire broke down. She didn't confess outright, but her tears and repeated muttering of, "I didn't know he'd really do it," offered more than enough to reframe the investigation. Claire's breakdown shifted attention back to Richard. When confronted with his surveillance of Emily, he remained silent for almost 10 minutes. Then, he leaned forward and asked only one question. "What do you believe happened?" He never admitted guilt, but his refusal to deny anything was telling. Max remained unreadable throughout, but when shown the drawing of the 3 shadowy figures again, he made one small change. He picked up a pencil, shaded out one of the figures and said, "That one didn't know what was going to happen." The room fell silent. Emily had known she wasn't safe. Her instincts were right. The people she should have been able to trust, most were the ones hiding behind a perfect facade. And now, the truth was almost fully exposed. One of them had poisoned her. Another had helped cover it up. And one, perhaps the most innocent-looking of all, had been caught in the middle of a lie that was never theirs to keep. The final days of the investigation into Emily Harrison's murder brought everything to a head. What had begun as a mysterious and tragic death had become a twisted story of secrets, control, and betrayal within a family that once appeared close-knit. The weight of the evidence was too heavy to ignore. The pieces had finally fallen into place, and detectives were ready to reveal the full truth. With Claire's partial breakdown and Richard's increasingly evasive behavior, investigators made their final move. They secured a court order to seize all digital devices from the Harrison household, including backup drives, USB sticks, and even the family's home router. Hidden among the encrypted files on Richard's external drive was a series of video logs, screen recordings of Emily's laptop, captured without her knowledge. These recordings showed Emily typing out her thoughts, deleting messages, and writing diary entries. There were over 40 videos, each documenting her most private moments. The last recording, taken just 2 nights before her death, showed Emily opening a new document and typing, "If anything happens to me, I want someone to know it wasn't an accident. Please believe me." That final message sealed what detectives already suspected. Richard had been watching his daughter obsessively. His control extended beyond parental concern. It was surveillance, deliberate, persistent, and invasive. He had been monitoring her every digital move, ensuring she could never truly speak freely, even from the safety of her own room. The evidence against Claire, though subtler, was also damning. Her pharmacy purchases, the call made from her phone, in the middle of the night, and her sudden panic during questioning painted a picture of complicity. Claire had not poisoned her daughter, but she had known something was wrong. She had known Richard's behavior wasn't normal. She had seen the signs, read the fear in Emily's eyes, and chosen to look the other way. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of denial, or perhaps out of her own dependence on the life she and Richard had built. And then there was Max, the youngest, the quietest, the one most people were quick to dismiss. But in the quiet of his room, Max had absorbed far more than anyone realized. He had known that his sister was afraid. He had seen the arguments, the surveillance, the tension between Emily and their father. In his own way, Max had been documenting it, through drawings, notes, and stories that mirrored reality more closely than even he might have understood. When detectives showed Max the last pages of Emily's journal and explained that they now believed she had been murdered, Max sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he whispered, "I thought she was just being dramatic. I didn't know it was real." It was the clearest sign that Max had been a silent witness to something far more sinister than a sibling's growing paranoia. He had seen the signs, felt the fear, but like his mother, had chosen to stay quiet. Faced with mounting pressure, Claire finally agreed to a formal statement. In it, she described the months leading up to Emily's death, how she had watched her daughter become more withdrawn, more anxious, how Emily had tried to talk to her about feeling unsafe. Claire admitted that she hadn't taken Emily seriously. She believed Emily was being dramatic, overwhelmed by school, or perhaps hormonal shifts. She had no idea, she said, that Richard had been spying on her through her computer. But when detectives asked why she had bought so many sedatives, Claire's explanation faltered. Eventually, she confessed that Richard had asked her to purchase them in small amounts to avoid detection. He told her he needed them for his own insomnia and didn't want to raise flags by buying in bulk. Claire claimed she didn't ask questions. She didn't want to know. But when Emily died, and the cause was revealed to be poisoning, she knew. She didn't need confirmation. She just knew. Still, Claire said nothing. She cleaned the room, called emergency services, and cried beside her daughter's body. She chose silence over truth. Richard was arrested days later. When confronted with the full scope of the evidence, Emily's message, the surveillance videos, the toxicology report, and Claire's statement, he finally spoke. He didn't confess. Instead, he justified. He claimed Emily had been spiraling, that she was unstable and needed help. He said he monitored her computer to keep her safe, to protect her from herself. He insisted that he loved his daughter and that everything he did was out of concern. But the facts told a different story. The poison had been placed in her tea. The sedative had been administered first. The level of planning involved showed intent, not impulse. Richard had made a choice, a cold, calculated decision to silence his daughter before she could expose whatever secrets he was hiding. Investigators never uncovered a single definitive reason why Richard killed Emily. There were theories. Some believed Emily had discovered inappropriate behavior, possibly related to Richard's troubling conduct at school. Others suspected she had threatened to report him for emotional abuse. But in the end, the motive mattered less than the horror of the act itself. A father had murdered his own child, a mother had helped cover it up, and a brother had watched it all unfold in silence. The trial gripped the nation. Richard Harrison was charged with first-degree murder, unlawful surveillance, and endangering the welfare of a child. Claire was charged with obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. Max, being a minor and not directly involved in the crime, was placed in protective custody and later into the care of extended family. Psychological evaluations revealed that he had been suffering from severe trauma and survivor's guilt. During the trial, Emily's journals were read aloud. Her words echoed through the courtroom, raw, frightened, and heartbreakingly clear. Someone in this family wants me gone. The line stayed with jurors, reporters, and viewers across the country. The verdict came swiftly. Richard was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Claire received a reduced sentence due to her cooperation and was sentenced to 6 years in a minimum security facility. She would later express remorse, stating that her silence had cost her the one person who truly needed her. The story of Emily Harrison became a cautionary tale told on news programs, podcasts, and documentaries. It wasn't just a story about murder. It was a story about how darkness can live behind the most ordinary doors, how fear can silence truth, and how a family can become a trap rather than a shelter. Emily had tried to speak up. She had written, drawn, and reached out. But no one had truly listened until it was too late. The final image of the case is one that haunted everyone involved. It was the drawing Max had made, the one with the 3 shadowy figures standing over the bed. When the courtroom saw that picture, the meaning became clear. Emily had never stood a chance. Her world, once filled with promise, had been poisoned by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Someone in the Harrison family had been lying, and that lie had cost a young girl her life.